Thank you everyone for coming here, and thank you to the Fullerton Library for inviting me here. So my name is Timothy Doran. I'm at Cal State Los Angeles. You have absolutely the open invitation to email me if you have questions or comments. There will also be a question and comment period afterwards. I'm a professor of ancient history and the thing that is also known as Big History at Cal State Los Angeles. My PhD is from UC Berkeley's graduate group in ancient history and Mediterranean archaeology. I earned that in 2011, and my main fields were Greek, Roman, and Phoenician history. My first book is called Spartan Oliganthropia, and most of my research has to do with the ancient Greek city-state of Sparta. And at Cal State LA, I teach a Greek history sequence, a Roman history sequence, Egyptian history, ancient Near Eastern history, historiography, and the aforementioned Big History. My next publication will be in the Historical Review of Sparta, and it is called Spartan Eugenics as Ideology and Practice. And I have two book contracts right now. Both will be on Spartan matters. And in fall, I'll be teaching at Cal State LA ancient religions from the Paleolithic to Christianity. So the stuff that we're talking about here is a set of interesting issues that I have worked on for a number of years. I live in Wilmington. Anyone know where Wilmington is in California? Can I see hands? Okay, so it's immediately west of Long Beach, between Long Beach and San Pedro. Nobody has ever heard of it before, including people who have lived in Los Angeles for decades. There's only one thing in Wilmington, which is the Banning Museum. It is the 1864 home of Phineas Banning, who was the founder of the Los Angeles Harbor. And I myself am a part-time volunteer docent there. So if you want to see an 1864 mansion and have me lead you through it and explain the history, I can do that. All right, so I always want to start with getting down the broad contours of Roman history whenever I do anything with Roman history. Our first period is the monarchy. It goes from 753 BC or so to 509 BC. This is the most mysterious period of Roman history. As you might guess from such a period, there are not a lot of documents. The second period is the Republic, going from 509 BC to, I guess I would say, 27 BC. And this is the period where the Senate and the two consuls were in charge of the administration of the Roman state. As you all know, it is during the Republic period that the Roman state began to acquire more and more and more territory, until by the end of this period, the entire ring of lands around the Mediterranean was Roman. It were a set of Roman provinces. In 27 BC, a person known as Octavian was given the title of Augustus by the Roman Senate, and at that point, we refer to the Roman Empire. We don't call it that because Rome didn't have an empire before this. It had a small E empire, but we give it the title the Roman Empire with a capital E because now it is led by an emperor rather than by a senate and two consuls. So the empire officially starts with Octavian being named Augustus by the Senate in 27 BC, and at least the western portion of it will fall in 476 AD. Those of you who are Roman history buffs are certainly aware that there is a considerable Peter Brown-influenced school of thought saying, oh, it wasn't a fall, it was a transformation. I'm really on the Brian Ward Perkins side of that debate, not the Peter Brown side, but we don't really have to get into that here and now. Now, I want to start with a background sort of picture of religion in the Roman world. Now, we all know a number of the Roman gods, the traditional Roman gods, Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, Mars, and so on. And these, starting from agricultural deities of just a small village in the 8th century, these become the official civic deities of the Roman holdings, and especially of the city of Rome itself. Traditionally, most persons in the Roman Empire will have familiarity with these gods, and they will proffer divine honors and sacrifice to those gods, and really before that, their own gods of their own land, their own area, and any other gods that they've heard of. So local gods in the lands through which they happen to be traveling on business, etc., etc. My point here is that polytheism was normal in the Mediterranean, except for one group, and this would be the Jews. It was rather strange in the Mediterranean religious scene to have a religion that claimed a monopoly on the truth. The general idea was that the world was full of gods, and you wanted to give offerings to whatever gods were the lords of whatever land that you happened to be in. Most people believed that the world was full of forces. These forces had volition, or at least some of them did, and at some point mythologies had accreted around these forces, stories about these forces, making them into anthropomorphic entities. Now, another big phenomenon, and I'm giving this to those of you who don't have, a really quick, ready familiarity with Roman religion. You're absolutely welcome here, of course. Another big phenomenon would be emperor worship. Upon their death, the emperors are usually deified by the Senate. Some are given divine-level honors and sacrifices even when they're still alive. This usually does not happen in the city of Rome, more in the provinces. The worship of the emperor and his family can be thought of in functional terms. It aided a feeling of unity in the Roman Empire, and this was quite useful, again, functionally, considering the very broad ethnic diversity of the many different nations, ethnic groups, peoples, etc., within the gigantic territories of the Roman Empire. Now, one exception to emperor worship and polytheism is Jewish religion. Now, of course, I'm sure that there are exceptions, individuals of the Jewish group that were sort of not quite as monotheistic as others, but officially speaking at least, Jews do not pay honors to gods other than Yahweh, and we have plenty of literary evidence that shows how this was a problem, such as Philo of Alexandria. Officially speaking at least, this idea was thought of as abhorrent to pay homage to gods other than their own God, Yahweh. This was seen by other ethnic groups in the empire as kind of strange and maybe distasteful because, again, the general idea was that all of the gods deserved respect, praise, and worship. And we know for a fact that, for example, Roman polytheists would also give honors to Yahweh if they happened to be in Israel/Palestine. They would sort of do this as a matter of politeness in a foreign country. Some people even thought that the Jewish god Yahweh was another name for the god Saturn, and they assimilated Yahweh to Saturn. Jews also did not worship the emperor either, and we do have literary evidence that Jews received special dispensations for their religion because of its the perception, which was true, that it was extremely venerable. Now, I want to give that as a sort of basic introduction, and soon you'll see why that's important. But first, let's talk about other religious developments of the imperial period. We see some innovations in Roman religion gaining strength, and one of them, for example, is religious ideas oriented toward the individual, rather than sort of traditional Roman religion, which was more oriented toward the state, toward the community, toward the group, trying to get the forces above to be benevolent to your whole group. These, I guess, new-ish currents include the popular worship of Egyptian Isis by people who were not ethnically Egyptian, the Persian god Mithras, the Phrygian Great Mother, the Syrian sun god, and other deities. Some of these promised something called salvation, soteria, which we'll talk about in just a second, and or an intense personal experience of the divine. Many included ecstatic elements in their practice. Ecstasis, from which we in English get the word ecstasy, means, of course, to stand outside of yourself, to stand outside of your normal self. Others of these sorts of religious movements required initiation rituals. These were referred to as mystery religions. And we know of some starting very early from the 7th century BC near Athens. A good example of one of the vital religious currents that was going on in the imperial period that was fairly new and certainly foreign to Roman religion was Mithraism. The Persian Mithras became popular in the Roman Empire. Most of our evidence is from the 1st century BC and a few centuries later. This was a mystery religion, and it did require initiations, and people that worshipped Mithras did this alongside other gods. They didn't give up Jupiter and Juno or anything like that. Now, this kind of interesting syncretic deity arose from the ancient Iranian worship of Mitra, who was a god of contracts. And he was worshipped in an updated form in the Roman Empire. There is a fair amount of hot dispute over the precise connection to Iranian origins. What we do have is a fair amount of iconography and some literary evidence. Here, for example, is a Mithras born from a rock. This is part of his legend. This is a tourist sample. For example, here we see a Mithraeum, and this is very typical with an altar type of thing in the middle, and then seats along the sides. These would be grottos that were dedicated to the worship of Mithras. Sometimes they were artificial, dark, and windowless, typically. This is probably how the celebrants utilized these spaces. You see them sitting on the side. And then in the center, you can see in the foreground someone who is kneeling, and he has a guide next to him. And they are kneeling, they are in front of a priest with symbolic cerements. And then behind them is a big relief. And we'll take a look at that in 1 second. Oh, a second has just passed. So this is the iconography that we see in all of these Mithraea, that's plural for Mithraeum. Mithras is killing a bull, but he is looking back at the sun, and nobody is precisely sure what exactly that is meant to mean. This was an initiatic society. The initiates were called syndexioi, which means joined by the right hand. There were 7 grades of initiation. All members went through the first 4, and the final 3 were advanced levels. We have from Capua frescoes at the Mithraeum there, and these will be the ritual that the initiate undergoes in order to be accepted into this cult. Now, I'm just showing that to show some of the variety that was going on in a very vibrant, crackling, energetic way in the first few centuries AD in terms of religion and the Roman Empire. We see other religious and philosophical currents, growth, for example, of otherworldly sentiments, a rejection of the physical world, love of mysticism. We see various strains of monotheism. We see an emphasis on astrology, magic, arcane practices. An example would be the Neoplatonism of Plotinus in the 3rd century AD, who popularized the idea of a single one, or the good, which was an infinite, unknowable, unapproachable force. You could only get close to it through mystical experience, and it was thought of as the ultimate source of everything. This is just meant to be another example of some of these currents. Another trend was promises of salvation. Soteria is what that says on that mosaic. Now, the question would be, salvation from what? What is it that you would need to be saved from or made safe from? And why does salvation appear as something popular to the people in the empire? It's a vague term, and some think it might be more applicable to safety from difficulties in life itself, the fragile and uncertain Mediterranean society of rootlessness, poverty and disruptions of ancestral tradition caused by the mixing of nations in a mobile and highly networked Roman Empire. After the famous good emperors of the dynasty of the Antonines, there will be a series of problems, things like plague, for example. And those sorts of troubles, you might think in Darwinian terms as kind of selecting for those religions which promise escape. The ones that promise escape/salvation will enjoy a kind of benefit in particularly turbulent times. We also have the phenomenon of thaumaturges. This just means magic workers. Wandering Mediterranean magic workers claiming special divine descent are not unheard of in the first 2 centuries AD. One is Apollonius of Tyana. He was an ascetic, meaning a refuser of luxury. And there are stories that he did miracles and prophecies, and even that he ascended into heaven at death. We have a long, very interesting and well-written biography written by Philostratus, who was born in the 170s and passed away in the 240s AD. We also see another religious and philosophical current of this period, and this is millenarianism. And we will find this amongst some of the Jews. The notion that an apocalyptic end of days was coming, and sometimes this would be identified with the coming of a Jewish Messiah who would do a few things. One was provide some sort of restoration of Israel, and this sentiment became stronger after the Jewish War of Vespasian and Titus in the 60s and 70s AD. And this figure was also thought or hoped to eventually drive foreigners out of Israel and reunite the scattered Jews to a renewed Jerusalem with a new temple. In some versions of millenarianism, idolaters, that is, everyone who was not a Yahweh worshiper, would be dealt with somehow. The problem with millenarianism is this. If you think that there is a predestined end of days, absolutely any political or social event can be shoehorned into a sort of schema in which you are saying, well, the stock market crash is clearly a prediction of the end of days. Basically, anything can be sort of interpreted as a sign that the end times are coming. Now, along came a Jew whose followers claimed that he was an avatar of Yahweh. We don't have anything written about him until the late 1st century AD. It's claimed that he was born in the reign of Augustus, so we would say 27 BC to 14 AD, and he performed magic acts. I'm always careful about saying a term like magic tricks because I don't really want to offend anyone, but I am the son of a professional magician. So whenever I see a magician on TV or in person cutting a woman in half, I can say to myself, oh yeah, I know how that's done because my father told me about every single trick. And I also have friends now who are professional magicians. So this individual partook in a millenarianist type of discourse, saying that an imminent end of times means that marriage and children are a waste of time. He is charismatic, and he advocates charity. His followers called him the one smeared with ointment. Ointment in Greek is chrisma, not charisma, but chrisma. And so his nickname became the Greek for the smeared with ointment guy. So this would be Christos. Chrisma is ointment, and Christos is the one who is smeared with ointment. He was executed for a treasonable claim that he was a king of some sort. The execution that was given to him was a particularly nasty one reserved for the worst criminals, and he was executed alongside common criminals. In the story, at least, that we have, the crowd reviled him and insulted him, and very nasty people made a cap of sharp sticks to sort of ridicule the fact that he was alleged to be a royal of some sort. They forced this on his head. And that's the story that we have. This very nasty means of execution made a particular impact on his followers after his death, and they started to carry strange miniature reminders of this form of execution for thousands of years. I suspect some of you are carrying them right now. A cult grew around the memory of him. Some claimed to have seen him after his death. Although he claimed that the end of the world was so imminent that people should stop bothering to marry or have children, it happily for us, I think, it never happened. As you may notice looking around, the world still exists, which I, for one, am happy about. In the early 2nd century, works would be written describing his life. One of the crucial steps in this swelling, the growth of the following of this Christos person occurred by means of Paul of Tarsus. What he accomplished was an innovation, which is that anyone who was attracted to the worship or the following of this very significant figure no longer needed to become a Jew first. In other words, did not need to be circumcised or follow the Jewish dietary rules. I would say that these innovations were crucial to the spread of the Christian doctrine because the costs of membership are dramatically lowered. Please imagine being over the age of 20, being extremely intrigued by the words of Christos, and then learning that you would need to undergo a circumcision. That doesn't sound like it would be the most attractive option. So by making it so that you did not need to do this, this would enlarge the potential net of members. We know that Paul traveled the Roman Empire widely, and he helped to establish Christian churches in many towns, villages, and cities. These communities started very small. Some would have only a few dozen members. Now, one of the things that we have from the 2nd century is a passage from Justin Martyr in which a Christian is describing his own practice, and this gets us closer to what these people were actually doing. Justin Martyr wants to emphasize that there was nothing particularly sinister in Christian rituals. They were healthful, and there was the provision of the Eucharist. He says, only those who believe the truth of the things we teach, who have been baptized with the washing for the remission of sins, and so regenerated and live as Christ directed, are allowed to partake of this Eucharist. So there is an emphasis here on membership in the community and acceptance of its dogma or its teachings. And there was also a kind of primitive communism, a redistribution of goods to orphans and widows that the members of this sect practiced. One of the interesting factors that probably led to some increase is the plagues that hit the Roman Empire because of the great connectivity, better sea lanes, easier means of travel with the suppression of piracy, leading to a big economic network, people going to and fro. This will lead to plagues. And one of the things that we see from our ancient sources is that Christians apparently would assist pagans, I'm just using the word pagans for non-Christians here, during plague situations in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And this impressed pagans who were tempted to run away and let their fellow pagans die. Christians, we think, helped because they feared death less, and also because they believed in charity. An interesting sort of argument comes from Rodney Stark, and he argues that if plagues resulted in higher Christian survival rates, then pagan individuals might end up with more Christian friends than pagan friends. And Stark argues that your ratio of friends can largely determine whether you convert. And Stark determined this as a generalizable rule from studying religious movements from the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries primarily. Of course, we would see friction between this new sect and non-Christians in the Roman world. A famous one is Pliny's encounter with Christianity in the early 2nd century AD. And we have a wonderful set of texts that survived. These are useful for understanding how Christians looked from a non-Christian perspective. Pliny was governor of Bithynia and Pontus. This is in what is now northern Turkey. And he had an exchange of letters with the Emperor Trajan. This is what Pliny wrote. "It is my practice, my lord, to refer to you all matters concerning which I am in doubt, for who can better give guidance to my hesitation or inform my ignorance? I have never participated in trials of Christians. I therefore do not know what offenses it is the practice to punish or investigate, and to what extent. And I have been not a little hesitant as to whether there should be any distinction on account of age, or no difference between the very young and the more mature, whether pardon is to be granted for repentance, or if a man has once been Christian, it does him no good to have ceased to be one, whether the name itself, even without offenses, or only the offenses associated with the name, are to be punished. Meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced by me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. I interrogated those as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. For I had no doubt that, whatever the nature of their deed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished. There were others possessed of the same folly, but because they were Roman citizens, I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. Soon accusations spread, as usually happens because of the proceedings going on, and several incidents occurred. An anonymous document was published containing the names of many persons. So this is all Pliny's writing. We have all of this. Obviously, this has been translated into English for your reading pleasure. Pliny continues, those who denied that they were or had been Christians when they invoked the gods in words dictated by me, offered prayer with incense and wine to your image. So this is emperor worship, right? Which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose, together with statues of the gods, and moreover cursed Christ, none of which those who are really Christians, it is said, can be forced to do. These I thought should be discharged. Others named by the informer declared that they were Christians, but then denied it, asserting that they had been, but had ceased to be, some 3 years before, some 3 years before, others many years, some as much as 25 years. They all worshipped your image and the statues of the gods and cursed Christ. He continues. They asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a god, and to bind themselves by oath, not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. From our perspective, it sounds like they were promising something along the lines of the Ten Commandments here. When this was over, Pliny continues, it was their custom to depart and to assemble again to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. Even this, they affirmed, they had ceased to do after my edict, by which, in accordance with your instructions, I had forbidden political associations. Accordingly, I judged it all the more necessary to find out what the truth was by torturing 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses. But I discovered nothing else but depraved, excessive superstition. I therefore postponed the investigation and hastened to consult you, for the matter seemed to me to warrant consulting you especially because of the number involved. For many persons of every age, every rank, and also of both sexes are and will be endangered. For the contagion of this superstition has spread not only to the cities, but also to the villages and farms. It's very deep in Bithynian society. But it seems possible to check and cure it. It is certainly quite clear that the temples, which had been almost deserted, have begun to be frequented, that the established religious rites, long neglected, are being resumed, and that from everywhere sacrificial animals are coming, for which until now very few purchasers could be found. This is the smoking gun here. It shows us who was complaining about these Christians. It was the people who were vendors of sacrificial animals who were suddenly getting their buyers, and not enough people were buying these anymore. So this is this kind of smoking gun in this absolutely amazing primary source. So now the vendors of sacrificial animals are happy because the Christians have been scared. Christianity has been sort of reduced, and people are now making sacrifices to the gods that demand sacrificial animals to be killed. Pliny continues. Hence, it is easy to imagine what a multitude of people can be reformed. What a multitude of people can be reformed if an opportunity for repentance is afforded. He's a very nice person. And now we have the reply from the Emperor Trajan. So, folks, this kind of fine-grained detail of actual primary sources is something for us to be very happy when we have it, because we don't have this from a lot of periods of human history. So this is what Trajan responds. You observed proper procedure, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those who had been denounced to you as Christians. For it is not possible to lay down any general rule to serve as a kind of fixed standard. They are not to be sought out. If they are denounced and proved guilty, they are to be punished with this reservation, that whoever denies that he is a Christian and really proves it, that is by worshiping our gods, even though he was under suspicion in the past, shall obtain pardon through repentance. But anonymously posted accusations ought to have no place in any prosecution, for this is both a dangerous kind of precedent and out of keeping with the spirit of our age, remarkably modern and fair-minded for someone writing a little after 100 CE. Okay, remarkably fair. Now, our question will be, okay, we have this growth appearing all over what is now Turkey, and as Pliny says, it's not just in the cities, it's in the countryside. Why did people find this religion so attractive? And I would say that we have also surveyed a bunch of other religious movements going on. So the reality is, other competing religions, if we want to think of this as a marketplace of religions to some degree, offered similar attractive features as Christianity did. Now, there is the immediate personal experience that Christianity gives, but that was also offered by the Greek mystery religions, by the worship of Isis. And if you're curious about this, read the book The Golden Ass by Apuleius, where the end describes all of the levels of initiation to worship Isis, and by the Magna Mater. Millenarianism, yes, Christian had that, but this was offered by some strands of Judaism. Salvation was offered of various types by various religions, Mithraism, Isis, and the Neoplatonism of Plotinus, some definitions of salvation. Now, of course, many people are attracted by the notion of the death and resurrection of a savior god. We have something like this in the Isis and Osiris story. Of course, everyone's favorite aspect of Christianity is the sense of human brotherhood, but the Stoic school of philosophy was already offering that in spades, and that started 300 years before Jesus was even born. Of course, we love sacramental meals. Yes, the Christians did them, but all they served was bread and wine. At the other sacramental meals, you'd have thick, steaming cuts of delicious beef. So I don't think that the Christian sacramental meals were really that competitive with the other ones. However, Christianity offered all of those things together, which none of those individual religions or philosophies did. It had also more attractions. Its founder was recent. This probably added to the notion that it was real. Miracles were part of its teachings. It used a holy book. Some people really like that. Its theology was becoming increasingly influenced by brilliant philosophical thinkers after, let's just say, 150 AD or so. Its message of universalism fit with the universalist ideas current, such as citizenship for all inhabitants of the Roman Empire in the year 212, and the notion of universal compassion, charity, and sharing, we would guess, would be very attractive in a troubled world of ridiculous differences in wealth. It also claimed to fulfill older Jewish prophecies. We find this in 2 sections of Matthew, where Jesus said he's going to fulfill older prophecies. Now, who became a Christian? Its followers are ridiculed as being poor and slaves, but clearly many educated people joined the cult. Again, it promised a package of many things to many people. Bureaucrats were impressed by its administrative hierarchy. The fact that magic and miracles were shown, again, I am saying this as the son of a stage magician. This might be not nice for me to say, but I'm guessing that not terribly educated folk would be impressed by that aspect, and please forgive me, I don't mean to offend anyone here. Intellectuals would be impressed by its increasingly impressive theology, and I think Jews would have been very interested in Christianity because, aside from the fact that it was a Jewish sect to begin with, it offered a way to de-ethnicize Judaism, to reconcile it with the cosmopolitan, larger Greco-Roman culture, keeping and in some ways making more rational, attractive elements of Judaism. We see this with Philo of Alexandria in the 1st century AD, trying to sort of fit Judaism with Platonism in an extremely intellectual way, but also discarding some of the less desired elements, less popular elements. We would guess that the massive population of slaves in the Roman Empire would be attracted by its notion of human brotherhood. That one still sort of gives me, goosebumps a little bit. Poor folk would be attracted by the sense of participation and involvement, and disliked ethnic groups. For whatever reason they were disliked, they might have been very well attracted by the notion in Christianity that ethnicity is completely transcended by Christianity. There is no Jew nor Greek. You will recall that line. Now, the awkward, bizarre, and completely inaccurate message that the world was about to end became de-emphasized to the point now where when you talk to Christians, they will say, no, that was just a metaphor. I really don't think that was a metaphor, folks. No offense. Now, let's talk about another aspect of Christianity that led to its expansion. Early Christianity gave to women good opportunities for higher independence and status. We've already seen deaconesses referenced in Pliny's letter to Trajan, implying, or actually stating, not just implying, that there were women who had official roles, important roles. Rodney Stark argues that this high female status in Christianity is due to a gender imbalance. I'm not sure if I believe that one. More likely, this is the case. The early Christian church had an anti-natalist streak. It did not participate in the pro-natalism, the pro-birth, the pro-family sort of ideology that was current in the Roman Empire amongst all of the people, the different nations. So the de-emphasis on the necessity of having children, which was of course connected to the Christian notion that the world was about to end, this meant that there would probably be lower birth rates, at least at first, while the idea of the imminent end of the world was still very, very strong before that started to fade with the embarrassing realization that the world did not end. So in the beginning of Christianity, let's say the first couple of centuries, we might guess that there were lower birth rates among women in Christianity. And as cross-cultural demography shows us, lower birth rates tend to coincide with higher female status in different societies. So familial duties would be less important if the end was near. Reproduction itself would be less important, since one might argue that the familial bloodline, the genos in Greek, would be de-emphasized, along with Christianity's de-emphasis on ethnicity, which we've already just talked about. Even when the end did not occur, path dependence still gave Christian females higher status for a while, for a few centuries. Eventually, a kind of more traditional patriarchy emphasizing the importance of producing children would be mostly re-established with some local modifications. And probably this is reflected in St. Augustine when he starts to become a bit more pro-natalist in his version of Christianity. Now, other models of religious conversion show that women join new religions. They tend to join new religions disproportionately, and this is argued by Stark. Christian women, one might think, would be attractive potential wives, even for pagan men. Why? Because Christian women had a reputation for chastity, duty, sobriety, sense of purpose, and some level of obedience. One probable stipulation, if you wanted to marry one of these Christian women, would be that the children need to be raised Christian, even if you, Mr. Pagan Guy, are not that interested in Christianity. So what we would guess is that polytheist males married to Christian females would also often convert to Christianity. This is what Stark refers to as secondary conversions. It is also referenced in the famous philosophical phrase, happy wife, happy life. This is St. Jerome. This is his 57th letter. And here he describes what certainly appear to be exactly the secondary conversions that Stark talks about. Jerome writes, the blessed Apostle Paul, writing to the Corinthians and instructing Christ's novice church in the ways of sacred discipline, among other precepts, laid down also the following rule: the woman that hath a husband that believeth not, so a pagan husband, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the believing wife, and the unbelieving wife by the believing husband. You yourself are the child of a mixed marriage, but now you and my dear Toxotius are Paula's parents. Who would have ever believed that the granddaughter of the Roman pontiff Albinus would be born in answer to a mother's vows, that the grandfather would stand by and rejoice while the baby's yet stammering tongue cried, Alleluia. Christians are not born, but made. So this is clearly representing a mixed marriage of a Christian and a non-Christian, and the way that the faith was inculcated into the next generation. This seems to be an expectation. Now, another argument is this, the notion of group fertility differentials. In Roman society, as many of us are aware, there would be a fair amount of infanticide. We know this all the way back from the Roman 10 tables from the monarchic period. However, infanticide decisions would probably be gender biased, kind of like what we saw, let's say, in the 1990s in China. Roman couples sometimes would expose, this means abandon, a baby girl for whom they could not pay a dowry. And we have a famous letter from Roman Egypt, the letter of Hilarion, that sort of says this very clearly. So what Stark argues is that this fact, the fact that there would be differential gender choice for infant exposure, contributed to a disproportionate number of males to females in the Roman Empire. I'm not sure if I buy that one, but let's just follow the argument here. Now, the fact that Christians, unlike just about everyone else in the empire except for the Jews, the fact that Christians frowned on infanticide, regardless of sex, and frowned upon abortion, which, of course, when we're talking about the first few centuries AD, was dangerous, crude, and unsanitary, often leading to the death of the mother, contributing to the reduction of female numbers. So if Christians didn't do those things, this might have produced a sort of interesting fertility differential. By the 3rd century AD, we find Christian communities flourishing in Italy, Greece, Spain, and Gaul, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa, and Turkey, Anatolia. This is a site of Cappadocia in Turkey. Have any of you been to Cappadocia in Turkey? Yes, I do recommend it. It's the geology is astonishing. This is where Christians, because the rock is soft, would dig out their rather amazing kind of grottos for worship. Also in Southwest Asia, Mesopotamia, Iran, even India. Some of these people would abandon normal society altogether. They would live as hermits in the deserts of Egypt, the mountains of Greece, caves in Cappadocia, and other isolated places. Now, this is an estimation. Again, this appears in Stark. I kind of lean on him because he is, in my view, the most factual, empirical sort of researcher of this entire thing. And he did lots and lots of research with other new religious movements, such as the Moonies in San Francisco. And it's from there that he decided that there seemed to be fairly standard ways that new religious movements tend to operate. So this is one estimate that I found very convincing in his work. So please look at the first column. These are years for the year 40. So this would be a decade or a little bit less after the crucifixion of Jesus. Then the year 50, then we jump to the year 100, then 150, then 200, then 250, then 300, and then 350. So a rather believable beginning number of Christians would be not very many in the Roman Empire in the year 40, maybe 1,000. I don't know of any scholar that radically differs from that. This started very, very small. Remember, before it became a cult, it was a sect of Judaism. So assuming that the population of the Roman Empire for most of these periods is about 60 million people, I think this is more or less what Walter Scheidel would say. That would mean that in the year 40, the percentage of the population of the Roman Empire would be extraordinarily small. 0.0017% of 60 million is 1,000. Now, what Stark thinks is probably right, and I tend to think that this is about right, is that we would see a growth rate of 3.42% per year. And he gets that from other religions that grew rather quickly. The growth would result from two sources. One would be conversion. Another would be natural increase. If we think of a percentage growth rate at something like that, 3.42%, then we start very, very small, but then things will start to take off. So please note that all the way through the year 200, Christians would represent less than 1% of the population of the Roman Empire. But by the year 250, they're at almost 2%. By the year 300, they're at something like 10%. By 350, they're above 50%. So we don't really need a miraculous group conversion if we just have a steady 3.42% per year. Something like this, probably not exactly this, but something like this is probably about right. Let's talk about how Christianity regulated its members. There's always the carrot and the stick. The carrot, if people persecute you, hurt you, or torture you, it doesn't matter because your reward is great in heaven. This is Matthew chapter 5, verse 12. This stick, there's lots of hell going on in Christianity, but if you insult a brother or sister, if you insult a brother or sister, quote, you will be liable to the hell of fire, also in Matthew. We also see a control of sexuality and very, very uniquely, very unusually uniquely in these kinds, this array of religions that appear here, we find a control even of sexual thoughts. This is a strange one. This is very unusual. In the Gospel of Matthew, we have everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery in his heart. And there's a control of actions. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. We also see a rejection of normal family obligations. Again, this is probably more active early on in this religion. In Matthew, we have another of his disciples said, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. But Jesus said to him, follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. So we want to contrast that, I think, with the Roman patriarchal family ideology. This is quite a sharp contrast. We find bizarre aspects of Christianity as well, such as a lack of concern for individuals' economically sustainable livelihood. We find this primarily in Matthew. And we find a certain mode of control that is quite effective. Promoting the notion that humans are full of sin allows the sale of a, so to speak, sin-removing product. In Matthew, we learn, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Now, please note, if you don't really believe in sins to begin with, this doesn't work at all. It only works if you first buy the notion that people are sinful. There are downsides to Christianity, and we see these early on. From Judaism, it received a notion that other religions were false. This probably did not please non-Christians. I want you to imagine that you're a good Roman. You have a shrine in your backyard. At this shrine, you regularly give sacrifices to, let's just say, Jupiter. And you meet a Christian, and he says to you, that is not a real God. That God is fake. And you say, I've been maintaining this shrine my whole life. My father did before me. My grandfather did before him. What are you talking about? We have been honorably worshiping the god Jupiter for generations at this shrine. And then a Christian says, well, that's just not a real God. That's fake. So we have a sense of a lack of compromise here, and the cohesiveness would appear as clannishness to outsiders. The way that Christians refer to each other as brother and sister, we would guess, would make someone who didn't know this idiosyncrasy expect that they were practicing incest. If you see a man and woman, a young man and woman walking down the street holding hands, and you overhear them and they're saying, yes, sister, oh, yes, brother, and they're holding hands, it doesn't look like they're just brother and sister. Of course, the rumors of eating Christ's body and blood would have looked cannibalistic or vampiric to outsiders. We would certainly guess that. And its followers often chose death over renunciation. This is obviously a very, very high-stakes game. However, alongside these rather awkward or difficult features, we have something very unusual, and this is the notion of the loving God. I would argue that the Christian God offered an alternative to the Roman pantheon of gods. Now, these gods did not offer a lot to their followers in terms of benefits and services. Those of you who have read Homer will note that often the Greek gods are not shown as really caring that much about people. If you think about Sumerian gods like Enki, we don't really see a lot of care either. So the Christian faith would present radical views contrary to the pagan belief system. Christian doctrine says that charity and loving one another will grant you a reward in the afterlife and continued belonging. Because of this, the doctrine decides that there's no need for sacrificial offerings to gods because, and I would urge you to think about the power of this, your good act towards other persons constitutes an offering itself. You don't need to pay for a goat to be slaughtered. The good acts that you do are considered an offering to the Christian God. The importance of charity and goodwill would attract many to the Christian faith, considering that these weren't really big elements in the pagan religious system. That absence would later cause the Emperor Julian the Apostate, reigning in the 360s, to demand that pagan temples conduct more charitable acts to compete with the Christians, which were growing in members due to these kinds of services of charity. Now, we will also see inefficiencies in persecuting Christians. The Roman government would often persecute and murder head officials of Christian churches and cities while leaving the followers alone to further spread the faith. Apparently, the Romans believed that killing top officials in a religion would destroy it outright. Pagans perhaps thought that the Christian priests were the only vector of Christian faith, but this technique did not really work out in terms of trying to obliterate this belief system. because in Christianity, you don't need to be a leader to spread and conduct Christian practice. It helps, but you can also be an enthusiast and work until that point. All right, now we're going to look at the century from 300 to 400. This is a crucial century for Christianity. We're going to start with the great persecution of Christians of the early 4th century. So 303 to 313, the emperors Diocletian and Galerius returned to a harassment of Christians that had fallen dormant for some 4 decades. Why persecute the Christians? Probably because they were thought of as traitors towards state religion and toward the Pax Deorum, which is the peace with the gods. You could also think of it as the contract with the gods. We get both our word peace and our word pact, P-A-C-T, from this Latin word pax. Possibly this was thought of as in terms of the catastrophe after the year 235, 50 years of chaos. Maybe they thought that this was visited upon human beings because of divine wrath at the lack of worship of the pagan gods, because too many people were bent toward Christianity. Also, I would guess that Christian congregations would seem to be a state within the state, and hence this is a threat. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, notes that Christians had a sheer opposition to what he thought of as the rational order. Oh, here's a great article in Harvard Theological Review by G.E.M. de Sainte Croix, Aspects of the, quote, great unquote persecution. It's from 1954. I highly recommend it. So what were the goals and what was the extent of this great persecution? Was the goal the complete extirpation of Christianity? By 300 AD, again, we are thinking that it represented 10% of the population. This means that almost everyone would have known at least one Christian, except the peoples very, very deep in the hinterlands. This is sometimes called the struggle to death of old and new orders. And no, I don't remember where I got that quote, sorry. The first edict in 303 AD, and we get this from the Christian writers Lactantius and Eusebius, apparently made it illegal for Christians to assemble for worship. Their sacred books and churches were meant to be destroyed. Christian officials, what I mean by this is officials who happened to be Christian would lose the privileges of their rank. Christians were not allowed to answer legal actions against them. So you want to think in terms of the Nuremberg laws in Germany when you think about that one. Christians could not file actions against those who assault them, and imperial freedmen Christians would return to slavery. Think about that. You had been a slave, you had been freed, but you were a Christian, and now you have to be a slave again. We have 2 Eastern edicts. Christian clergy would be arrested unless they sacrificed to pagan gods, and in the 4th edict in 304, all inhabitants of the empire were obligated to sacrifice to the gods, meaning obviously the traditional polytheist gods. So in 304, all these edicts would apply to all Christians. We don't know why a persecution occurred in 303. It's strange that it happened at all. Diocletian's wife and daughter were sympathetic to the church. Diocletian had appointed Christians in high positions. There was, however, a recent incident in the Roman army on campaign against Persia. Eusebius says that there was a purge of Christians within the army that had preceded these edicts. We don't really know why 303 was the year when this happened. In 305, the Emperor Diocletian abdicated formally. He gave as a reason his age and his sickness. His co-emperor, his co-Augustus Maximian, also resigned. So the persons that were promoted were the junior emperors at this time, Constantius Chlorus, Constantius the Pale, and Galerius. These became promoted to the new Augusti, or senior emperors. So what happens next is that the Roman government collapsed. Diocletian's careful system, known as the Tetrarchy, collapsed, and now there were 7 people claiming that they were Augusti, that they were the senior emperors, whereas there's supposed to be 2 Augusti and 2 of the junior ones. Constantius Chlorus died in the year 306, and his army declared his son Constantine as Augustus. Galerius refused this. There was some civil war. At the end of the year 310, 5 Augusti ruled the empire. Constantine, Maxentius, son of the emperor Maximian, Galerius and his protege Licinius, and a man named Maximinus Daia, the son of the sister of Galerius. April 30th, 311, Galerius was dying of groin cancer, and his colleagues instructed provincial governors to grant the members of the Christian church freedom of worship, legal tolerance, recognition, and the right to assemble to worship. This was a great about-face. The stipulation was that Christians, quote, will be bound to entreat their God for our well-being, us, the imperial families, and for that of the state and for their own. This clearly indicates to me that these emperors did believe that the Christian God was powerful, was not a fake God at all. That is the only interpretation that I can get from this. Why would you stop the great persecution? Licinius, Constantine, and Galerius' wife had Christian sympathies. Eusebius says that God gave Galerius the illness, and there is an amusingly disgusting description. You might expect that in a description of groin cancer. The simplest, hence most plausible answer is that the persecution of Christians initiated by Galerius and Diocletian had simply not produced the desired result. Many Christians had kept their faith despite mutilation, death, imprisonment, the horrible punishment known as damnationes ad metallum. Anyone know who that is? What that is? That condemned to the mines to actually do mining. Imagine what a miserable punishment that would be. And even destructions of churches. In fact, it seems that the sufferings of Christians had the exact opposite effect. They provoked sympathy for the Christians by non-Christians. Pagans sometimes protected Christians against the law, and the bottom line was that national unity and harmony, so to speak, were harmed. And this brings us to the Battle of Pons Milvia, the Milvian Bridge. In 312, we have civil wars between Constantine and Maxentius. A battle near the Milvian Bridge across the Tiber River occurs. Maxentius's army is defeated completely. Maxentius is drowned. There was a Christian rumor. Just before the battle, according to this rumor, Constantine had a vision. He instructed his soldiers to mark their shields with the Chi Rho. The first 2 letters of Christos are Chi and Rho, and this is how you can make them into a superimposition. So this was an appeal to the Christian God to write this on your shield. This may be a moment of great desperation. Did Constantine regard his victory as a sign? We have 2 versions, Eusebius and Lactantius. They're a bit different. One says this vision happened at night and the other during the day, and there are some other differing details. Now, Constantine and Licinius reiterated the pronouncement of tolerance toward Christians with the Edict of Milan in the year 313. Probably this was a compromise. Licinius was a pagan. Constantine worshipped many gods, and one of them was Christos. Constantine needed a divine sponsor, especially a kind of single supreme power. And for a while, as we can see in this image, Sol Invictus, the god Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, filled the role of a one supreme power, since the worship of Sol Invictus was heading toward henotheism. Henotheism is a kind of midway point between polytheism and monotheism, where yes, you believe all the gods exist, but you think that there's one supreme one. So a sun god would be a rather good pick for that. So here we have this medallion showing Constantine in front and then Sol Invictus in the back. You can see the rays of the sun emanating from his head. Here is Sol Invictus and our previous friend Mithras slaying a bull. Sol Invictus worship, incidentally, has some iconographical and other overlap with Christianity. In the Vatican City, we have a pre-4th century necropolis showing Christ himself with solar rays coming out of his head. Nice iconographic overlap here. So Constantine seems to have kind of settled on Christianity, but we shouldn't take that too far. He was a polytheist. He fully tolerated polytheism, but he bestowed money and favor on Christians, involved himself in their theological disputes, and became convinced that he was the champion of some very powerful God and was also victorious by divine grace. My question would be whether he saw Christianity as a useful glue to increase social solidarity in the empire. And here I'm always tempted to think of Ibn Khaldun's idea of asabiya, sort of a sense of social cohesion. We don't want that to go away. I would also guess that he was impressed with the Christian world's well-organized administrative structure. It operated as a kind of state within a state. This is how the hierarchy worked. We have 2nd and 3rd century sources showing a distinction between the clergy versus the laity, and the clergy would be divided into several ranks. Patriarchs in Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and later Constantinople, and then archbishops, also known as metropolitans, and then bishops and ordinary priests. And as we know, over time, the Bishop of Rome would claim more and more power. Now, there are some perils of success. Once Christianity stopped facing external enemies, internal disputes would intensify. Arians believing that Christ was human versus Trinitarians believing Christ was equal to the Father and the Holy Spirit. Constantine resolved this in 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea. Christianity's success would cause Christians to become intolerant and oppress pagans. Christianity, upon becoming conventional, lost some of its spiritual intensity. Again, a solution for this was to go out into lonely places and to live a more intense form of Christianity as an ascetic. Now, again, one problem Constantine saw was that Christians were dividing up into a large diversity of beliefs. This meant that some unity needed to be brought in. So he encouraged Christian councils, Arelate in 314 and Nicaea in 325. Council of Nicaea, 120 bishops attended, Constantine presided, and they formed the Nicene Creed. And I was raised a Catholic, and I keep trying to remember it. I'm going to say it. I believe in one God Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things seen and unseen. And that's as far as I can remember. In any case, this declared that the Son was of one substance with the Father. And they also condemned the idea that I mentioned a moment ago of a certain Arius, who saw the Son as subordinate to the Father. In 324, Constantine was sole emperor. 324 to 330, he built a magnificent capital at the old city of Byzantion, now called Constantinople. And this would set the stage for the Byzantine Empire. He dies of illness in 337, is baptized a little bit before that, but that was not terribly uncommon at this time. Now, our questions would be, did his patronage of Christianity cause it to rise, or was it already huge, as some of those statistical modelings would suggest? His sons in 337 were Constantius, Constantinus, and Constans. As we can see, he was a very modest fellow in terms of naming his children. In 353, Constantius II emerged as sole ruler, and he appointed Constantine's only surviving nephew, Julian, as the junior emperor, the Caesar over in Gaul. Julian was successful in war. His soldiers declared him an Augustus. Constantius died, and then he became sole emperor for a couple of years, 361 to 3. Now, this actually could have dealt a harsh blow to Christianity. Why? Because Julian was raised Christian, but in the closet, he was a pagan. He was a secret pagan intellectual. And now that he was the most powerful person in the world after becoming emperor, he proclaimed his loyalty to the old gods. He tried to organize pagans, and as I mentioned a few slides ago, to make pagan ministers become more moral and to advocate those aspects of Christianity that worked so well to keep people in, such as charity. He admired Christian priests' charity and morality. He was a monotheist or perhaps a henotheist. He was a Platonist, a pagan, believed in the transmigration of souls, a semi-vegetarian, probably a devotee of Mithras. We have 2 works of his that have actually survived. Incredibly exciting. He even attempted to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem, and this was stymied by either earthquakes or vandals. He sent a physician to Delphi to repair the Temple of Apollo, and supposedly there was an oracle from the spirit there. Tell the emperor that the Daedalic Hall has fallen. No longer does Phoebus, that is Apollo, maintain a chamber, nor the oracular branch of laurel, nor the prophetic spring, and the speaking water has been silenced. This is a most grim oracle to be received if you are the person that is trying to revive the pre-Christian religion of the Roman world. This incredibly famous and important Greek oracular shrine has given the most doom-laden message you could possibly get. Now, I would think it's fair to say that these are the last moments of polytheism as a strong religion in the Mediterranean. This is, whether you are a Christian or not, this is the death of an entire religious and hence cultural and philosophical system coming around now, never completely dying. There are worshippers of Zeus right now. I've actually met a few. Julian dies in 363, speared in the stomach in a campaign against the brave Sassanid Empire. Here is a famous relief showing him down on the ground with the god Mithra and Shapur II and Ahura Mazda standing over his body. Julian's successor is Jovian, who completely repudiated Julian's pro-paganism, continued Constantine's church subsidies, closed some pagan temples, prohibited sacrifices, and the Chi-Rho would appear on his coins. He died at 33 of an unknown cause, possibly indigestion. And Christian writers, who of course loved him very much, could not understand why Jovian had not received a longer reign as a divine reward for his praiseworthy Christian course of action. This is still a mystery. We next get the Spanish general Theodosius, appointed emperor of the eastern half of the empire. An interesting surge in the power of the church occurs during his reign. The Bishop of Milan, Ambrose, was the sort of instigator of this, who was very much of an adopter of Cicero, Virgil, and Plato to Christian purposes. Ambrose asserted that in the realm of morality, the emperor is accountable to the Christian priesthood. This would influence Theodosius from 387 onward. Theodosius had thousands of persons massacred in the circus at Thessalonica, and Ambrose then excommunicated the emperor and refused to give him communion until he had repented. Now, the fact that this was something that someone could do and that people would care about tells us a whole lot about the success of Christianity at this time in the late 4th century. And this would set a precedent for churchmen controlling imperial officials. Under Theodosius, polytheism would be mostly destroyed. Now, there are certain currents in the study of this that now downplay Theodosius's role in all of this, but much of this did occur during his reign. Along with his co-emperor Gratian, he caused Orthodox Christianity to be the only legal religion in the Roman Empire. It seems that during his reign, polytheism was outlawed and several extraordinarily important pagan temples and institutions were destroyed. the temple of Apollo at Delphi, the temple of Serapis in Alexandria, the institution of the virgins of the goddess Vesta in Rome, which were in some ways synonymous with Roman identity for 1,000 years plus, even the games at Olympia. Gratian removed the pagan altar of victory from the Senate house, and in 391, as far as we understand, all pagan temples were officially closed and pagan rites were forbidden. Now, I want to look at a couple of slides here to show this is not just a political thing, it's not just a religious thing, but what we're going to see here is a shift in visual expression as well. This is the transformation of classical art. Obviously, these two images are different mediums of art, but I want you to look at them and see the contrast. One represents the old pre-Christian pagan way of doing things, of seeing people, of representing people, and then the one on the right is the Christian one that largely replaced it. Artists in classical Greece, whose standards the Romans, of course, shared, sought to depict heroic physical perfection. Christian-themed art would avoid this. It would instead depict what they thought of as the inner person. New Christian art would emphasize deep eyes, slender forms, heavily robed, and realism and perspective would be, at the very least, de-emphasized, in some cases completely abandoned, and instead of those techniques, rich colors would be used to show grandeur. So in the 5th century, Christianity was now the official religion of the Roman Empire. It would survive the West's fall in 476 AD, and continue in the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, which lasted for another 1,000 years. We'll see a split between Christian communities occurring in Southwest Asia and the Mediterranean basin with Nestorism. This belief would spread through the Silk Roads, and we would find Nestorian Christian communities in Central Asia, India, even in China by the early 7th century, an absolutely astonishing spread. Polytheism would continue in an attenuated form. The cities of the Christian Empire would become quite Christian. Older polytheism of the Greco-Roman sort would survive mainly in the countryside. Country dwellers were called pagani, and so non-Christians now became to be called pagans. It meant something like a country guy or a hick or something like that, because the sophisticated urban centers were so very Christian. It's only the places left behind in the hinterland that would be pagan. Polytheism certainly became less and less practiced. So in conclusion, let's talk about why Christianity prevailed. And this is going to be a shorter section because we've already discussed all of the features that I think would have impressed people the most. We've discussed its strengths, but was not traditional polytheism also strong? Were there weaknesses in polytheistic pagan religion? One scholar calls paganism a very spongy, shapeless, easily penetrated structure, vulnerable to a sharply focused and intransigent creed. Paganism, we might guess, perhaps, had become to be less vivid and intense, or at least seen as less vivid and intense, and again, lacked charity for the poor, a strong enough moral structure, and even, we might think, hope for the future. It also lacked a tight, disciplined organization with a sense of special purpose, and of course, it had come to lack the patronage of emperors, with Julian being the final patron. And furthermore, we might guess that paganism had come to lack a strong enough reason to create families and raise children after Christianity had abandoned its anti-natalism when the world did not, in fact, end and Christians realized, well, we should probably, do normal things like have children and raise them. And I would argue that this last reason is kind of a significant one. Reproduction is the key, maybe not to everything, but to lots and lots of things. And this brings us to the old saying that demography is destiny. Thank you very much. And I'm ending this with an illustration of the decay of polytheism from Saint Jerome. The gilded capital today looks dingy. All the temples in Rome are covered with soot and cobwebs. The people hurry past the ruined shrines and pour out to visit the martyrs' graves. Even now in Rome, heathenism languishes in solitude. Those who were once the gods of the Gentiles are left beneath their deserted pinnacles to the company of owls and night birds. The army standards bear the emblem of the cross. The purple robes of the kings and the jewels that sparkle on their diadems are adorned with a sign of the cross that has brought us salvation. Today, even the Egyptian Serapis has become a Christian. The Huns are learning the Psalter. All right.